Who came here with their families and hung out a little bit before? Checked out the, all right, yeah, even some woos. So I'm thinking of you all, and I'm like, crap, this is the part where they're all just going to crash. After lunch, you've been exhausted, running around the park and stuff, so stay with me. I promise I'll try to make it worth your while. We'll start with this guy, who I lovingly refer to as Von Vapor. So Von Vapor is on the phone with his team, and he says, great news, everybody. We're going to redesign the homepage. We got the green light. So here's our team. They're Skyping with old Von Vapor. And so Von Vapor gives the news. He's like, hey, we're going to redesign the homepage. Team says, that's great news, boss. Right? Yeah, the current homepage is super ugly. Right? Don't even ask about the code quality, lol. Right? You know, exciting. It's finally going to be, we're going to get a chance to do this right this time, right? We're going to be using BEM. We've been hearing so much stuff about all the visuals are going to be clean and flat. We're finally going to look into React, maybe make some use of that. Maybe this will even give us a chance to re-platform, right, to a new CMS. Grunt, right? Von Vapor hears all this and says, make it so, right? That sounds fantastic. And we do this. This is what happens, right? We get a chunk of time, we get a chunk of budget, we get a scope of work, and we do our best effort, right? But this happens sort of again and again. And, the scope is an issue because what ends up happening is we end up with these experiences that might not exactly look great. I'll use Getty Images as an example. I'm only using them because I was looking up photos of vaping businessmen. So figured I would start there. But here's our homepage, right? It looks nice. And then you get this, right? Inside page. And then you get this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and this. I don't even know what the hell this is. And this, and this, and this, right? So it's like, look familiar to anybody, right? You run a big operation, right? You have 5 different clicks, you get sort of 5 different experiences, right? These incongruent experiences is frustrating for our users, right? That's one thing, right? Scope of work influences and creates these situations. Geography is another one. Here's Canon's website, their global site, and then you get their North America site, their Latin American site. Chile apparently warrants its own design. European site, India, Australia, China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, right? So same brand, just wildly different sites. And I'm sure that there's a lot of organizational reasons why they did things that way, but it's sort of interesting to see how different those all are. And there's this guy. Maybe the biggest jerk of them all, right? Father Time, right? Huge jerk. So you get a site like eBay, right? You go to their homepage, and it's nice and clean and modern and thin fonts and all of that, very 2016. And then you start poking away at the interface, and then you end up sort of back in 2007, right? And then you sort of go down a rabbit hole, maybe go back a couple years, 2004 maybe, and then eventually you end up in 1999, right? It's some like weird Benjamin Button shit, right? Then there's this. Sort of everyone's favorite whipping boy in the UX world, United.com. Let's count how many unique button styles they have on their homepage. Oh, can we try that? Can we get some audio there? All right, let's try this again. The audio is worth it, right? Edgar Winter Band, Frankenstein, fittingly, right? 13 different button styles on their homepage alone, right? That's crazy. That's just one page of the site, right? So by now you're like, all right, all these big organizations, big enterprise, these are sort of like scale problems, right? Big, sort of huge, massive organizations, but that's not us. I work at a startup, right? It's a typical scene. Sorry, they're all eating pizza. And they're like, yeah, we don't have time for cohesion and continuity, right? We're too busy disrupting, right? We're too busy. We don't have time for that, right? And then they all laugh and go back to playing ping pong or whatever. And so this is the thing, right? At the end of the day, right, all these reasons, people perceive you as one brand, as a singular entity. They don't care that, the design team is in New York and the development team is in Romania. They don't care that this project got built in an agile way and this one followed the bento box flavor of agile and this one is sort of an old sort of crusty waterfall process that we'll talk about. They don't care that Bill and Janet don't get along and can't be in the same meeting room at the same time, right? Like, your users don't care about this. They see you as this sort of singular entity, all that great stuff that Sarah was talking about earlier, right? What are you communicating to your users? But this is our challenge, right? We are faced with creating more stuff, right? More products, more services, more features, more functionality, more content, and serving those up to more mediums and more formats, to more countries, more languages, more customers, more users using different browsers, devices, environments, screen sizes, form factors, contexts. It's like, good luck, right? That's all the content I have for you today. Is good luck. Just kidding. So this is where we're at, right? So how do we actually approach this Herculean task of serving all these things to all these users in all these different contexts? Well, the industry has been hard at work, sort of tearing up the page in pretty much every aspect of how we go about doing our jobs. From a strategic level, rather than these sort of big monolithic redesigns where we sort of bulldoze the old crappy site and put a new shiny site in its place, we're recognizing that that isn't exactly a great strategy, right? Jared Spool talks about the magic escalator of acquired knowledge, right? People take time to learn your interface, right? Whenever you bulldoze all that stuff and put something new in its place, you get a lot of pissed off users, right? You move my cheese, right? Now I have to relearn all this and sort of climb back up that magic escalator of acquired knowledge. So what we're learning, right, and this is Luke Wroblewski's slide, sort of documenting a lot of the iterations that happen over software. This is starting to permeate out even to larger organizations. We're recognizing that doing this giant monolithic redesign every 3 to 6 years is not a good use of time, right? We have to be more iterative, break off smaller chunks. From a process standpoint, right? Everybody, if I had $1 for every time I heard, we're trying to be more agile, I would be not on stage here, but like over the Kennedy Space Center about to blast off in my private rocket. Whoa, that was a weird thought there. Sorry, I have a lot of caffeine in me. Anyways, so this notion of we're trying to be more agile, right? What does that actually mean? Well, there is a capital A agile thing, right, that involves Scrum Masters and a bunch of other weird language that I don't fully understand. But this general desire of sort of being more iterative, of getting things out the door faster, about spending time, building real software and sort of shipping that stuff faster and more iteratively and more collaboratively is a sentiment that I'm sure all of us could agree are all good things, right? So sort of trying to break up these big monolithic processes and moving towards something smaller and more maintainable. Content perspective, right? Karen McGrain has written entire books on this topic, right? Of trying to make our content more modular so that it can go more places. A great example of this is NPR's COPE, Create Once, Publish Everywhere platform that they created in order to send their stuff to their mobile apps, to their websites, to the Times Square sort of marquee, and all these different places that they send their content to, right? By breaking things into smaller chunks, as Karen recommends, they're able to serve their users wherever they may be. From a code standpoint, the notion of object-oriented programming predates the web by a long shot, right? And so a lot of the back-end people here might, are familiar with these concepts. Anybody that, has any sort of programming background will understand these concepts. But just now, in the last few years, we've sort of, that stuff started finding its way into the front end of our matters. And that's why we end up with things like SMAX and BEM and OOCSS and stuff like that. From a visual design perspective, we're recognizing that, coming out of the gate with a bunch of full comps that make all sorts of assumptions about layout and content and all this stuff before, that stuff is fully baked, right? We're using things like style tiles to sort of break these things down into their smaller, more elemental aspects and have conversations about color, typography, and texture, right, without having to make all these full-blown comps. Right? Dan Mall, and I'll talk more about element collages, but this technique that he created that sort of helps break things down and have informed conversations with the client without having to worry about what our footer design might look like. And then lastly, sort of breaking down our UI design, right? Anybody work at a place that has to do stuff like this? Make 3 different comps of the same screen? It's okay, this is a safe place. This is a safe place. Yeah, there's quite a few hands, right? This is, I get it, but this is nothing more than a tremendous waste of a talented designer's time, right? And no tilting the iPhone and iPad slightly is not going to sell it. That's not what we do, right? But so thinking about our web designs as these pages and sort of showing that page on an iMac and showing that page on an iPhone and showing that page on an iPad, it doesn't really help the cause, right? So we have to, right, blow up, right, this notion of thinking of the web as a series of pages, but rather, and quite literally, blow up our interfaces into these smaller components. Right? We're not designing pages anymore. We're designing systems of components. Does anybody use Foundation by Zurb? Okay, a few hands out there. Again, Bootstrap people, where are you at? There's a lot of people crapping on Bootstrap earlier today, huh? Are you just slinking down in your chair? Well, here I go again, so prepare to be embarrassed again. No, I think that these things are great. Again, if you talk about sort of not thinking about our UIs as pages, but rather as these systems of components, that's what those tools are, and they're fantastic. But as Jeffrey and Sarah have already mentioned, right? This is my issue with them, right? Whenever I watch sci-fi movies as a kid, I'm like, why are they all dressed the same? Right? Just some guy came in and he's like, hey, everybody, we're just going to wear jumpsuits from now on. And people are like, oh, okay. I guess I'm down with that fashion check, right? Let's move on to music next. Of course, that's not how human beings operate. We all have different goals and ambitions and needs and whatever. And the same thing goes with our websites, right? Whenever everybody is using the same tool, Bootstrap is the most starred repository on GitHub, right? Whenever half the internet is using that, you're going to get that substantial similarity. So it's, you get this sort of one-size-fits-all tool, which is great, and it does a lot of things. That's fantastic. But if Nike, Adidas, Puma, Reebok were to all redesign their sites using that same tool, they would look substantially similar, right? And that's sort of not what they're going for. Right? They give you a lot of stuff, but as Jeffrey mentioned, right, your end users have to download all that extra stuff, right? And on the flip side of that coin, they might not go far enough, and then you end up having to write a bunch of custom code yourself, right? How does this stuff work in with your existing sites and code base? And lastly, how do you, you have to subscribe to somebody else's naming structure, things like that. Jeffrey mentioned, and Rachel will talk about row-based sort of grid systems and stuff like that. Maybe that makes sense for you, but maybe that doesn't. I personally don't want to write class equals Jumbotron in my code. That sort of feels weird to me. So, but again, conceptually, these things are amazing. Dave Rupert, a good friend and Austin-based sort of web developer, they worked on the Microsoft.com redesign with his company Paravel. And he wrote this article about what they actually delivered to the client. And he really hit the nail on the head by saying that, it's really about making tiny bootstraps for every client, right? And he says that responsive deliverables should look a lot like fully functioning Twitter Bootstrap style systems that are custom tailored for your client's needs, right? So it's not just about using a design tool like Bootstrap, a design system like Bootstrap. It's about taking the time to craft your own Bootstrap, right? You craft your own design system that serves your user and your business needs. So that's what's led to the explosion of this notion of sort of creating pattern libraries and design systems, right? So there's sort of 6 different flavors of style guides I'll sort of run through really quick, starting with sort of brand identity. And again, Sarah did a great job sort of, introducing a lot of this stuff, so I'll go quickly over this. But these brand style guides have been with us for a long time, oftentimes, encapsulated this nice like hardbound book that you'd see at like advertising agencies and stuff. But that stuff is now making its way online. This is West Virginia University's style guide, which is really fantastic. And they show, here's how you use our logo, right? Here's the spacing around the logo. Here's what not to do with the logo. Here's some alternate logos that you need to pay attention to. Here's our tagline and how that should be treated, right? Here's our fonts, here's our colors, right? Wrangling all this stuff and putting it under one roof allows everyone that's interacting with this brand, that's using those assets to create communication materials for their organization. It gives them those guidelines, those rules, those sort of helpful tips so that they don't go off script. There's a couple different tools that I'm really excited about. One's called Brand AI, which you could upload your own logos to, color palettes, icons, and then it sort of encapsulates them in these little sort of variables, and you could suck them into your code base, suck them into your design tools, suck them into Microsoft Office and stuff. So you're sort of managing all your brand assets under one roof and sort of wiring all that up. Another really good one is called Frontify, sort of like an online sort of brand style guide sort of generator. So that's that one. We get up to design language, and I sort of talk about design language in the sense of sort of guidelines and styles that sort of help govern a product or suite of products. Google's material design is a great example of this, where they sort of articulate this whole philosophy of their sort of material world, this 3D world, and they talk about their color usage and sort of the philosophy behind that, right? And these are in animation, which I'm sure Val will talk a lot more about tomorrow. But sort of articulating this stuff as these general principles helps whoever's creating products for Google, and as it turns out, lots of people that don't work at Google, it sort of gives them this set of guidelines and resources to use and mental models to use in order to make effective products for the company. So voice and tone, right? Again, Sarah touched on this a little bit, but I definitely recommend checking out voiceandtone.com, which is MailChimp's voice and tone sort of resource. And MailChimp, if you're familiar with them, right, they're an email marketing company. They have this cute little chimpanzee as their mascot, right? They have this nice, really cheeky sort of tone of voice most of the times, right? And so they recognize that tone of voice needs to be applied in the right places under the right circumstances. So that's what the site lays out. It's like, the user just hit submit, they sent out that week's campaign, good job, and basically the guidelines say, yeah, you could act like really cheeky and have the little Freddy mascot come out and be like, hey, good job, you deserve a raise, eep, eep, right? And that's cool. But on the flip side of that, let's say one of their users just spammed 30,000 people, or their credit card just got declined. You're not going to have little chimpanzee come out and be like, hey, people, see, you just spammed 30,000 people, and by the way, you're fired. You're not going to do that, right? So it's sort of giving guidelines around how to communicate with your users in the appropriate situations. They also released their sort of more comprehensive content style guide that I highly recommend checking out when you get a chance. Then we get into writing style guides, and these have been around for ages, right? The Chicago Manual and all that stuff. But whenever you have, especially in this sort of CMS universe, right, you have a lot of people contributing content to your organization, having them write in a consistent way, right, sort of grammar and punctuation and stuff like that is important to be consistent, right? Do you use the standard comma, right? You know Bob, comma, Sue, and Greg. They came to my house. Do you use the Oxford comma? You know Bob, comma, Sue, comma, and Greg. They came to my house. Right? Do you use the walk-in comma? I mean, you know. Bob, Sue, and Greg. I'm not, I can't do it justice. But just having that, I think, like, giving those rules. And it doesn't have to be some crazy detailed thing. This is actually one of my favorite web pages on the internet. Dalhousie University, they have this like little one-pager that's basically like writing effectively for the web. It's like use headings, use bulleted lists, link to other things. Like, it's beautiful, and it sort of practices what it preaches. So I definitely recommend that. Just even putting something as basic as that in can help, a bunch of jargon and a bunch of crap from seeping into your company's content. We get code guidelines, right? And again, sort of coming back to this trend of, sort of these methodologies, right? You as a front-end web developer and all of your web developer colleagues, your front-end colleagues, have to decide, right? Is this how we do it, right? Is this how we do it? Is this how we do it? Is this how we do it, right? Is this how we do it? So Morse code syntax that I made up. gzips really well. There's like a couple dev chuckles in there. I love it. But yeah, so we're seeing more and more of these sort of code guidelines make their way into the world. GitHub's is especially great. I also came up with a little sort of front-end guideline questionnaire. It's just like some questions that you could round up all of your front-end developers on your team and sort of go through this questionnaire and be like, hey, what do our HTML comments look like? What do our CSS comments look like? How do we structure our files? What do we name things, right? Establishing those sort of guidelines allows everyone to work better, allows your future self to be able to revisit a code base, 6 months or a year down the line and not go like, what the hell was I doing, right? So having that stuff, and new hires especially, it's like a great way to get them on board with how you guys do things. And then the last one is pattern libraries, and that's what we're going to focus on. There's a Walmart style guide or pattern library, and it shows here's what our navigation looks like, here's what our buttons look like, here's what drop-downs look like, here's what our tags look like, here's what our sort of product tiles look like, here's what our sidebars look like. Right? And by sort of having all those things in place, anyone that is making things for that company are able to sort of take those component pieces and assemble them into the right order in order to sort of solve their goals. So these sort of 6 flavors of style guide all sort of work together to sort of form this sort of overarching design system, right? This thing that can help really help your company, help your organization address that sort of myriad of contexts and features and users and all that stuff without losing your minds in the process. So how do we actually make this thing happen? How do we actually establish these design systems? Well, you have to sell it. You have to speak the right language with those, I love how Laura calls it the VIPs, right? Very important persons. Right? How do you sell this to people that control the purse strings? Well, pattern libraries, design systems, they promote UI consistency and cohesion, right? That means that instead of your user having to relearn and experience a UI every time they click through to the next screen, right? By the time they get to the checkout flow, they've already encountered those same patterns, so they're familiar with it. They know sort of how to operate. Jacob Nielsen talks about this, right? Consistency is one of the most powerful usability principles, right? When things behave the same, users don't have to worry about what will happen, right? Instead, they know what will happen because of that earlier experience. Total common sense, but holy crap, that is hard to execute on, right? Faster production, right? This is one of the main benefits. This is why so many people reach for Bootstrap or Foundation, right? Here's this kit of parts. It's already made. I don't have to go and reinvent the wheel, right? That means I could focus on actually building new features or iterating and making those sort of features better. Anna Debenham and I ran a podcast where we interviewed people who have implemented successful design systems at their organization. And we interviewed Federico Holgado, who is a designer there. And he talked about, he sort of shared this story about their status page. And basically, status page is just, is MailChimp up or down? Is there a problem with it or whatever? This isn't a page that gets hit a lot, right? This is not like one of their primary screens of the app. And he talked about that. So they made their design system using the first sort of four primary screens of their app, right? So like the main thing that 90% of users are going to use 90% of the time, right? They focused on that and built their component library out of those pieces. But then whenever they had a free minute, they were able to sort of revisit those secondary and tertiary pages. And I love how he calls them dark corners, right? He's like, here are the dark corners of our web experience. But he's like, by having this pattern library in place, we were able to just chuck in a couple patterns we were using a bunch of other places. And by having that already sort of 95% of the way done, they were able to elevate the quality of that status page, to look consistent and also just be just as responsive and performant as the rest of their site. Dave Rupert again, he's like, psst, having a style guide means I took a rough feature prototype to production-ready design in under an hour. It's like, here's the power right here, right? Shared vocabulary, this is huge, right? Whenever the developers call the thing the utility bar, and the designers call it the top bar or admin bar, and then the other stakeholders call it, that thing at the top, right? It's helpful to have a common language so that you don't have to spend, 30 minutes in a meeting arguing about like, oh, are we actually talking about the same thing, right? Having that, prevents all that sort of communication breakdown from happening and allows you to focus on doing better work together. Makes things easier to test. Laura did a great job talking about, components and their impact on performance by being able to zero in on any given component and seeing what that speed index is of that particular component. As you sort of weave that stuff into your production environments, its performance implications, right? By being able to sort of zero in on a pattern in isolation allows you to test for accessibility, allows you to test for performance, allows you to test for responsiveness, allows you to sort of make sure that that thing works as it should. Right? Lincoln Mongelo, who helped make the Starbucks style guide, he said, it makes things easier to manage over the long term, right? You're able to debug things more effectively, right? You're able to sort of see how your code looks on a site versus having a bunch of various sort of instances of those patterns across, scattered across hundreds of pages. It's a useful reference to keep coming back to as you develop new features and iterate over your designs. And lastly, it sort of serves as this future-friendly foundation. I was actually just talking to somebody this morning. They've had a style guide in place, but it's starting to get a little crusty around sort of the edges from an aesthetic standpoint. And it's like, I get that. If you were to make a style guide in the Web 2.0 days, you probably still wouldn't be reaching for those like heavily beveled, drop-shadowed buttons, right? You'd be like, no, thank you. But what's great about that is that you can, if you were to redesign your entire design system, right, you don't have to burn everything down, right? You don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? You could focus on, reskinning it and making it more modern and making it more usable and making it more sort of worthwhile, right? But you're still going to have buttons. You're still going to have inputs. You're still going to have a hero unit. You're still going to have cards of some sort or whatever. So it's like, this is a fantastic foundation to establish and build and grow with for years to come. So I've been in these meetings. I've been talking to a lot of people and trying to sell them on this stuff. And they're like, yeah, but that still sounds hard. And I get it, but not really. So sometimes you have to make them feel the pain. I love this tool. This is cssstats.com. You can slap in a URL to that field and hit the go button, and it will spit out all of your unique styles, the quantity of rules and properties contained within those styles. But as you sort of scroll down, it will highlight all those sort of 50 shades of gray and like off-white that are sort of similar, but not really. Is a great way to sort of start to have those conversations about normalizing things and establishing a system. One of the other things that I think is really helpful is to conduct what I call an interface inventory. what an interface inventory is, if you're familiar with the content inventory, where at the beginning of a design project or something, you go through and you wrangle everything, and you're able to have a better sense of what the scope of work is and all that, who owns the content, and so on and so forth. Well, this is like this, only for unique interface design patterns, right? So you comb through the site looking for patterns, hunting for patterns. And the best way to do it is to get everybody involved in the success of the project in the room together, including the fireman. He's the crucial piece of the puzzle there. No, but getting everybody, not just like one designer, you and a buddy going off to go do this exercise. Get everybody in that room together, and in the course of an hour, just sort of bash things out. I've found using sort of Google Slides is a really helpful way to do this. Basically, you just need a place to dump screenshots. And I really like Google Slides just because it's linkable and you could sort of share them and combine them at the end of the exercise. But then the actual screenshotting exercise involves going through, and I sort of divvy out these tasks whenever I do consulting gigs and work with organizations of like, okay, you're on icon duty. You're challenged with looking up, all sort of things that could be considered blocks, like a media block or a card or something like that. You're on navigation duty, right? Breadcrumbs, pagination, primary navigation, things like that, right? And basically, you do this exercise and you round everything up, and then at the end of it, you sort of present the findings, right? Everybody, sort of takes 5 minutes to sort of showcase what they saw. And this is where that sort of conversation starts. This is where that establishing that shared vocabulary. This is where sort of some of the context about like, oh yeah, I know why that thing exists, right? I lost that battle years ago or whatever. So, it's a helpful way to get everyone on the same page about the current state of your UI. And what's great about this is that, so once you're done with this, you sort of combine them all into one Uber document, and then you put that on the CEO's desk. If you've ever wanted to see your CEO cry, it's a great way to do it, right? You don't need to be a designer to realize that having 50 unique button styles is probably a bad idea, right? So this really visually, in a very sort of, visceral way, shows like, hey, here's the result of us not having a design system. And then sort of the last step is to regroup, right? So with like a smaller working group, start going through that inventory and going, okay, this is gonna stay, this is gonna go, let's keep this, let's kill this. So, interface inventories that document your interface patterns, pointing out those inconsistencies, helps get that buy-in from those VIPs, establishes the scope of work for the project, right? How long is this going to take for us to create? How many patterns are we going to have to design and build, right? It plants the seed for your sort of shared vocabulary and lays the groundwork for the pattern library. So, okay, you do all that stuff, talk about the benefits, do the interface inventory, show it to them, and the boss goes, nah, I get it, again, I get it, we just don't know, right? Like with so many things, if the boss says no, just do it anyways. Because here's the thing, right? In order to make the whole, we have to make the parts of that whole. Again, common sense, but it's all about how we treat those parts, right? So, Lego, right? Talk about this. And Jeffrey talked about Legos, right? So it's perfectly viable to have a pile of Legos, reach your hand in, grab the piece you need, and continue that process and build some stuff, right? So that's one way to do it, and that's sort of what we have been doing. But by taking the time to sort of organize those pieces into a way that they're easier to find, easier to discover, and you actually have some sort of system in place, in that same amount of time, right, you're able to roll out a lot more stuff, right, build a lot more stuff, because it's not just this frantic sort of ad hoc process. So that's what we're after, and that's what sort of led me, sort of down this road of what I call atomic design. So what atomic design is a methodology, is sort of this mental model for how we think about our interfaces. Because again, we're still tasked with making the final product, right? We're still tasked with making the whole. But let's also take the time to very deliberately and very thoughtfully put together an interface design system that sort of underpins our final work. So that's what atomic design is atoms, molecules, organisms, templates, and pages that all sort of work together concurrently, and that's a key thing. This is not like a linear process, and sort of Jeffrey said, like start with the doorknob and build up from there. It's like, we sort of have to build the cathedral and the doorknob at the same time. One influences the other. It's not sort of a this, then that. It's not, let's build the page and then tear it down. It's a this and that, right? It's let's build the whole and the parts at the same time. So atoms. What are the atoms of our UIs? Well, things like labels, inputs, buttons. By themselves, they're sort of not terribly useful, but they are the basic building blocks of our UIs. At the molecule level, we sort of take those atoms and combine them together. Now suddenly, that label atom is defining that input atom. Clicking that button atom will submit that form, right? So now at this molecule level, we have these relatively simple components that whenever you break them apart, you get a handful of HTML tags. But now you have this nice little encapsulated piece of functionality that you could drop in anywhere you need to include search. At the organism level, we take those molecules, right, this search form molecule, and put that into context of a header organism, right? And that header organism might be comprised of a logo atom, primary navigation molecule, search form molecule, but all of those things collectively operate as a unit, right? And we see that on pretty much every site we ever go to, right? We see these relatively complex components that are all sort of operating as a sort of standalone piece of the interface. And it might be made of a bunch of disparate stuff like a header, or it might be the same sort of, product card molecule repeated over and over and over again in a sort of product grid organism, right? But again, this thing is, anywhere you need that product grid, whether it's like search results, product category page, related products, things like that, you could just drop in that organism. And then at the template level, what we're doing is we're taking those organisms and combining them together to form a page, right? But the big thing here, at the page level, what we're doing at the template level, we're simply defining the underpinning sort of content skeleton, right? We're applying all of these components to a page layout, making sure that they all sort of work together and drive together. But it's at this page level that we're taking that sort of content scaffolding and pouring real representative content into it. This is what our final UIs are made of. This is what our users are going to interact with. This is what your client is going to sign off on, right? This is what you and your team are going to deliberate over. Having that context is important, but it's also at this stage that we're sort of validating or invalidating the effectiveness of the underlying patterns, right? What happens in that hero unit whenever we pour this kind of image in here versus a really crowded image with a bunch of people in it or something, right? Is that text still legible? Can you still read everything? Does it resize properly, right? What happens if that hero title is 45 characters long versus 350 characters long, right? Does the pattern break, yes or no? Right, so it's at this stage that we're sort of making sure that all those sort of underpinning patterns are doing the jobs they need to do. And if they're not, then we'll go back and sort of solve that at a more atomic level. It's also at this page stage that we're testing variations of a given template, right? You might have a web app with a dashboard page, and the user logs in, and they get to see all their recent activity, all their recent transactions, a bunch of charts and graphs and stuff like that. And that's fine for normal users that have maybe been a user for at least a couple months or a year or something. But what about that new user, right, that Crystal's going to talk about in a couple days? Right? What about those new users? Do they get recent activity? Well, there isn't any yet, right? How do you articulate that? Still the same underlying template, right? But how do we sort of manipulate the UI to sort of serve a bunch of different, use cases? What happens? WordPress's admin is a great example of this. If you have admin privileges versus you're just sort of regular author, right? You get a bunch more links, you get a bunch more sort of options. Still the same UI, but we're sort of conditionally sort of switching things on and off. So I've been working this way for the last 3.5 years now, and I'd say that still the biggest advantage it provides is that ability to traverse between the whole and the parts, right? To be able to simultaneously see how I'm building my final UI, but also sort of blowing things up to their total atomic bits, but then stepping through how those bits come together to form that final UI. I found that clients don't really care too much about atoms, molecules, and organisms. They're like, how much will this cost? And it's like, don't worry about it. But at the same time, I still think it's really helpful to point this whole methodology out to them and sort of expose them to it to help them better understand, like, yeah, we are creating this system of components. We're not just making you a new flashy homepage. There's a lot of thought that's going into making these components reusable and extensible, flexible. And then sort of the building happens in the in-between stages. Pages are there to sort of review and, I guess, sort of test the resiliency of those patterns. And then atoms are sort of there as a helpful reference to sort of see your base styles and stuff. It's worth pointing out that atomic design is for user interfaces. It's not like a CSS methodology or anything like that. It's just a way to think about user interfaces. So your bank's kiosk or Microsoft Word or Photoshop or whatever, you could apply atomic design to. So this is Instagram, and you could sort of see how that interface comes together and can be broken down into, you know, these various stages of components. And it's also worth pointing out, because I have to answer to this all the time, that people get really obnoxious with names and stuff, and I happen to choose some names that I thought were helpful. Atoms, molecules, organisms has a nice sort of implied sense of hierarchy, if you're familiar with any sort of high school level chemistry. But other people are like, why don't you call them elements and modules and components? And then person two is like, why don't you call them base, components, and modules? And I'm like, exactly, right? Those names are sort of arbitrary and don't really have that sense of built-in hierarchy. But that being said, you know, don't let that stop you. If your team members, you know, don't understand or want to use that language, that's totally fine. The team at GE, General Electric, they started off using sort of atomic design sort of nomenclature, but then found that a bunch of people were getting tripped up, and so they ended up sort of, you know, taking the concept and sort of applying it and sort of, you know, retheming it to something that made sense for their team and allowed them to do good work together. So that's awesome. So like, don't feel like the naming is like rigid and you know, this is not like a religion or anything like that. It's just sort of a useful mental model to help get your team thinking about your UI in this sort of hierarchical way. Okay. So how do we actually make this stuff worthwhile, right? We have to kill this old process, right, of making these 200-page wireframes, which get handed off to a visual designer that ends up making homepage underscore v17 underscore final underscore final underscore v2 underscore for review underscore final final underscore v2 underscore for dev review underscore final in all uppercase .psd, right? We have to get away from that and then, of course, throw that over the fence to the developers who get all pissed off because it's totally, you know, and utterly unbuildable, right? Too bad. You know, we've already burned through everything. So get it done in 2 weeks and shut your mouths, right? So we have to stop this. And I say that one of the biggest things that we could do in creating these design systems is to treat front-end development as a core part of the design process. It has to be that way. Because this is the current state of affairs in many of the places I go to, right? Oh, the designers sit on this floor and the developers sit in the basement. Right? And I would get this, right, quite a bit. And it's like, I write HTML and CSS and presentational JavaScript for a living. And they're like, oh, you're a coder. Go sit with the Ruby folks and whip us up some gems. I'm like, that's not what I do, right? So I think it's really important to recognize that sort of front-end design, right? Those people that are writing HTML, CSS, and JavaScript serve this very real bridge between that sort of design and development world. We're sort of, you know, 1 foot in one and 1 foot in the other. But by being part of that process, right, rather than this sort of stepped process wherever we come in after the fact, let's build these cross-disciplinary teams that get that perspective and get into the browser as fast as possible, right? So once we've done that, we start establishing direction. This is what our wireframes look like anymore. I'm just going to breeze over this really quick, but basically what we do now is not 200-page PDFs, but really just a spreadsheet that goes, here's what goes on the page and in what general order, right? Here's the organism, here's sort of the things that are made up, that make up that organism, and here's sort of the job it's doing on the page. And then having a conversation about, hey, is this the right stuff to have on the page, and is it in the same general order, right? What's cool about this is that this ultimately sort of becomes the mobile-first view of the page, right? This is what happens whenever all your sort of content's stacked. This is more than enough to have an informed discussion with your clients, with your colleagues. So it's like, all that sort of like balsamic stuff, all that Xura stuff. And I'm not saying that those tools don't ever have their place, but it's about sort of trying to have good conversations with a little bit of stuff, right? And that's what sort of style tiles allow us to do again. It's like, here's what, let's put together some color ideas, some, typography explorations and stuff like that, and have a conversation about it. And Dan Mall, who's on next, is absolutely genius at doing this, right? It's like, here's the project we did for Entertainment Weekly, and it's like, here's just some stuff I'm playing around with. Like, here's sort of what I'm thinking, here's what I'm feeling. How do you guys feel about this? Like, does anything sort of stick out to you? Do you hate any of it? But it's just, it's a conversation. It's about moving the design forward rather than saying, like, I need your thumbs up or thumbs down, right? And that's it, right? It's about having a conversation about what's going to solve our user and business goals. Typography is another great thing that we're able to sort of, have anybody used Typecast in here? Yeah, it's a cool tool, right? You could put together a little web font, sort of font pairings, and sort of put this in front of the client. This is something Dan did whenever we were working on the TechCrunch redesign. It's like, here's some stuff, here's your content, and here's it in a couple different sort of font pairings. Let's have a discussion about this, right? So it's not about getting like full sign-off. It's just about presenting enough to have an informed conversation and establish that design direction. And from a front-end standpoint, I'm sort of there at the beginning of a project working in a tool that I sort of helped make called Pattern Lab to create these sort of atomic components, right, in code. So this is something that we did for Time Inc., their website, and this is a component. This probably looks familiar to a lot of you, right? It's on a lot of different sites. And the way we're sort of making these things work is with Mustache, which is a templating language. Pattern Lab now supports underscore and blade and twig and a bunch of other stuff. But in order to make this component, we have a little block of markup, and all the orange bits in the double curly braces is Mustache code. So we have a dynamic URL, dynamic headline, dynamic excerpt, but the real power is that little sort of greater than sign. We're saying that greater than sign is an include, and we're saying, I want to include a thumb, which is that sort of 400 by 300 image, right? So now we could take that, and anywhere we need that little chunk of code, anywhere we need that pattern, we could use that same greater than symbol, that little include symbol, to include that particular component. At the organism level, looking at sort of a site header, you crack open the hood of that, you see. So we have a header tag, but we're including our logo, we're including our primary nav, we're including our search. And now anywhere we need, right, our header, we just use that same pattern. So you can sort of see where this is going. It's like Russian nesting dolls, right? The little things are included in the bigger things, which are included in the even bigger things. And what's great about this is that it helps keep things nice and dry, right? You know that concept, don't repeat yourself, right? So if you needed to change your logo, you change that logo atom, and anywhere that logo atom is included will propagate out to wherever it's included. So you don't have to go sifting through 50 PSDs looking for every instance of a particular component, right? You get some client feedback that's like, oh, we need this extra little tag in here in this component. You don't have to go, crap, right? I got to go fishing, right? So it sort of helps keep things nice and dry. And then at the template level, what we're doing, and I'll just sort of show you, this is the Time Inc.'s homepage template. We're just sort of scaffolding out, again, sort of showing that sort of underbelly of like the sort of content skeleton of the homepage. We're using a couple different components the same way. We're sort of giving them a name so that we can latch into the hero and sort of, dynamically change the data. But at the very beginning of the project, from literally day one of the project, we're able to do this work. Right? I sort of treat it as like being a prep chef in a restaurant, right? These people come in the day before and sort of chop all the carrots, chop all the onions, right? Marinate the meats, prepared the salads, and they do that so that the next day, whenever everybody is in the restaurant together, they can focus on making great meals together rather than some person going, hang on, we need a carrot, I gotta go run away and chop a carrot, right? So what we're able to do is prep all these patterns so that we could actually collaborate with the design team rather than sort of coming in after the fact and saying, okay, you design it and then I'll eventually build it, right? So this is a project we just did earlier this year for About.com. This is hour one of the project, of our sort of like kickoff exercise. It was like, okay, we're gonna have a hero. What does that look like? Who knows, right? But we're going to set it up as a pattern in Pattern Lab and just sort of build this stuff out. Here's that pattern again, right? We're probably going to have that, right? We're going to have a little sort of, see more sort of drop-down thing. Here's a little social share thingy. And again, this is not good-looking work, but that's okay. We're just sort of getting that sort of structure there, right? Jeffrey was talking about the importance of web standards and writing semantic markup. It's like, that's what we're doing. Just sort of getting that stuff in place so that we can sort of come back through and iterate about 100 times, right, over the course of the project. But we're getting into the final environment as soon as humanly possible. So once we get to that point, we end up with these sort of weird-looking situations where you have these grayscale, sort of wireframey in-browser prototypes, which is great, but of course they look like trash, right? So what do we do there? This is where we sort of take, and sort of collaboratively take some components. Global header is a great place to start. So this is, again, Dan Mull's work. Sort of going, okay, here's some ideas for the header. We'd show that to the client. I'd sort of have an in-browser version of that thing, and we'd be on these client calls, right? And then they'd be like, no, I don't like that. Can we move this here? Can we do this? And then I'd do a little screen share and use Web Inspector to push this there and that. Has anybody ever done that in a meeting? And people were like, like, oh my God, who are you? What planet are you from? This is amazing. It's like the easiest way to, if only like children's parties were like that exciting. It's like, hey, let me show you Web Inspector. But it's cool. So by having sort of this 1-2 punch of sort of static comp of this thing, but also working prototype of this thing, we're able to simultaneously articulate, here's like color typography, texture, layout sort of doing its thing. But then, oh, by the way, in the browser, we're articulating, here's responsiveness, here's performance, here's accessibility, here's interactivity. Here's what the real fonts look like. Here's what the real colors will render like, right? So we'd end up in these situations where we're sort of slowly but surely building each component, but you end up in these sort of weird hybrid states, and that's fine, right? So long as you're constantly collaborating and communicating with the client. And it's really only at this stage that we finally get to comps. Once we've already established a solid brand, color palette, typography, a couple, handful of the sort of global patterns, then we sort of start going in and sort of painting that full picture. And again, simultaneously sort of building this stuff out in the browser so that whenever the client feedback goes from like, whoa, you have the big picture wrong, and into, oh, can we nudge this over here? Can we add a subtle gray border around this? We're like, yeah, cool, we'll do that. But we're going to do all of that iteration in the browser. So this is what we ended up with. Remember this little pattern at the beginning of the project? This is, we iterated here. This was sort of the first stab at it, second stab at it, and then this is what we ended up launching with. So it's normal. It's this nice iterative sort of building up fidelity over time. And it has designers and developers working together to sort of simultaneously design and build this stuff, get it into the browser, and once it's in the browser, keep it there. So that's how we do things, right? We're in the magical world of Disney, right? And so we lived happily ever after, right? We have this nice collaborative, cross-disciplinary process. We deliver to our clients, this fully functioning, not just production-ready front-end code, but also this beautiful pattern library that underlies it. So they live happily ever after. Or did they? Right? Has anybody worked on a project where you make a pattern library and it falls out of sync, right? Ends up in this situation, right in the trash can beside all the PSDs and, PDFs and stuff? That sucks, right? So this requires a fundamental change in how we do things, right? This is what we think we do. This is whenever someone asks, like, what do you do? It's like, well, that, right? I make websites, or I make web apps, or whatever you want to call them. right? And then sort of this pattern library is sort of this offshoot of that website that sort of serves as documentation for what that pattern or what that website is. But you can see the problem with this, right? This is what ends up happening. It just sort of snaps off and fades into the abyss. And it's like, well, that was fun for the like 3 days this thing was in sync, right? So we have to reimagine what it is we're actually creating. And this is sort of where we're landing, right? We're recognizing that we're not just building a website, we're building a system that builds that website. And that same system could also build that pattern library. And so by treating things from like a system level first, that recognizing that in order to make a change to a pattern on this particular page, it is going to have a ripple effect anywhere else that pattern is included. Nathan Curtis said, style guide is an artifact of a design process, right? It's almost like a fossil, whereas a design system is like this living, breathing thing, right? With a roadmap and a backlog serving an ecosystem, right? It's a product. So here's some things you could do to sort of keep your pattern library and design system out of the trash can. Make it adaptable, right? So anybody remember this guy, Ron Popeil? Right? Set it and forget it. It's like, that's what we can't do, right? We do not want to do this. We don't want to go, okay, we launched the site, we made the patterns, these things are set in stone, and if something doesn't, serve your needs, tough shit. We can't do that. It has to be adaptable. Recently became a homeowner, and every time I do a new project around the house, right, I go to my basement, I look at my toolkit, and I'm like, okay, what do I got, right? And then, I quickly learn that I can't, apply mortar with a claw hammer, and I'm like, Home Depot run, right? So I sort of have been thinking about pattern libraries in the context of like, how many Home Depot runs do I have to make, right? The team at Canonical, who makes Ubuntu, the sort of Linux operating system, put together this absolutely gorgeous decision tree about like, we have a pattern library. Does this pattern already exist and serve your needs? Great. If the answer is no, can that pattern be adapted to serve your needs and also keep like the main functionality intact? If the answer is yes, then sort of make a prototype and we'll sort of roll that into the system. If the answer is no, it doesn't already exist, then it's like, okay, does something similar already exist? If so, then sort of go back up and again sort of answer that question. But if it doesn't exist, right, it's like, okay, prototype a concept, let's see what you got. And then it's like, can you make this a generic reusable pattern? And if the answer is no, then okay, apply it to the site directly. But if you can, right, they have like an extra layer with like themes and stuff like that. But then eventually we're going to roll this into the design system. This is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful chart that sort of helps map out those decisions and make sure that your design system is serving the applications in a way that solves the real problems. Make it maintainable. Jeffrey taught, once upon a time, the Holy Grail sort of referred to this 3-column layout, as Jeffrey said, but now it's sort of the Holy Grail of design systems is having a design system whose production environment and pattern library are perfectly in sync, right? You make a change to one, it updates the other, right? The best place one of the first places that did this successfully was Lonely Planet, the travel company, and they basically, in their pattern library, only expose the API hook that's required in order to pull an alert into your page, which is just absolutely wild. So here's the code for that, right? So they're not showing markup. This isn't like copy and paste markup. This is like, we're centralizing our front-end architecture and then sort of beaming that out with our API. And of course, the pattern library and production environment both consume that same API, so making a change to one will update the other. So that's sort of what they're doing there, right? Design system, pattern API, serving their site and their pattern library. A project or process that I follow, since I work in Pattern Lab, which is sort of my sort of laboratory and sort of dev environment, design and dev environment, we basically will sort of take it there and then sort of deploy it out either with like an automated process like Grunt, so it'll like copy over the CSS and JavaScript and patterns. Another strategy is to put the pattern library right in the production environment. This is what people at Phase 2 are doing with Drupal builds. So you can put pattern lab right inside of a pattern lab, or inside of a Drupal theme, and everything sort of serves the same stuff. Make it cross-disciplinary. Recognize that, front-end developers or back-end developers or whoever's implementing this stuff isn't the only potential audience for your pattern library, right? If you show a bunch of code, it's going to scare those people off, like right out of the gate, right? This has the potential of being this watering hole for everyone that's involved in the success of the project. If you take a site like Walmart and think about just that carousel component, right? They have to worry about the content strategy. They have to worry about, the product owner is worried about sort of what content's going inside there. Visual designers, UX designers, front-end developers, back-end developers, they all are responsible for the success of that component. So make sure that those voices are documented in the pattern library. Make it approachable. The US government released their design system, which is fantastic. And they're serving this giant audience of all these different, sort of people making websites for the federal government. So they have to make sure that, getting started, getting up and running is nice and easy. Make it visible. Release it out into the wild. I'm like super excited to see what Laura and her team are doing with Etsy's pattern library. And in the meantime, we have Anna Debenham and I, we run a site called styleguides.io where we round up all the public examples of style guides out in the wild. So if you want some inspiration, there's over 170 examples of people that have published their pattern libraries to the world. And before you sort of get all like, oh, but this is like an internal tool. Why would we ever release this to the public? We're sharing our trade secrets. We're going to get in trouble or whatever. Right? These things have tremendous impacts on recruitment. Gina Bolton, who we interviewed for our podcast, she saw Salesforce's pattern library they did for one of their apps and was like, that's awesome. I need to work there. And since she's been there, they've launched what's now sort of the high watermark for the entire industry, the Lightning Design System, which is just incredibly comprehensive and wonderful. And if Salesforce hadn't released that thing to the wild, she might not have ever gone there. Make it agnostic. Naming stuff is really freaking hard, as you know. And it's tempting to go, okay, I'm going to call this course block because we're putting a course in here and that makes sense. But that immediately limits what kind of content you could put into that pattern. Instead, it's a little harder to do, but making things sort of more structural or more agnostic in their naming allows them to sort of go more places, right? Things like feature block or list group. One strategy I've found to be helpful is to sort of take a component, blur out all of the text and stuff, and instead sort of put in, and then ask somebody, say, hey, what is this thing? Make it contextual. Show where each pattern gets utilized, right? Pattern Lab has a feature where you're able to see what patterns make up any given pattern and also where this pattern is used. So if you were to make a change to any given pattern, you'd be able to sort of track down all the places you need to QA. And then lastly, make it last, right? Communicate change to your users. Material Design publishes something on a semi-regular basis that says, hey, here's what's new with the design system. Marriott, they send out a monthly email newsletter that says, hey, here's what's going on with the design system. Here's what's been launched. Here's what's been doing. Here's what we've been doing. The team at Ship, they integrate it with Slack, their tools, so that if a change comes into the design system, their design team is pinged over the tools they use to communicate. So if you do all these things, right, your design system won't be like that sort of used car that as soon as you roll it off the lot, it loses like 50% of its value or whatever. But instead, sort of turning it on its head, that becomes like a fine wine that increases in value over time. And if you do that, you could be like this amazing guy that I found on Getty Images. It took me a long time to pull the trigger to buy it because it was actually pretty expensive. And as I just sort of watched it play out, I'm like, all right, this is going in my slides. But yeah, follow these rules. It just keeps getting more awkward. It doesn't, oh, jeez. That could be you, ladies and gentlemen. If you're interested in learning more about this, writing a book, it's almost done, it's almost out, probably about like a month out, writing it all in the open, but you can pre-order it online, give me money, $10 or whatever. But yeah, if you want to learn more about this, I write about this in even more detail, and if you want to hang out and chat with me, I'll be around for the next couple days. So thanks very much.